Yeah, we should be live. Yeah, I think we're live. Let's just give it 5 more seconds because the feed tends to be slower. Cool. Izole to Africans of the Azanian soil. Thank you so much for your patience. We do know that we are 3 minutes late. We were having some technical difficulties, but we do appreciate your patience and your commitment to being here and engaging us. As you are aware, this discussion is around, the crisis in the education sector that we are finding ourselves in, wrought by the novel Corona-19 virus, which has exposed in many ways how, our socioeconomic systems have made us vulnerable in particular ways, and education has been no different. We got together as young people interested in this problem to try and think through what becomes the best way to respond in the background of a particular vacuum in the space from civil society, from student movements alike. And part of it is probably because these are unprecedented times, and the forms of organizing also that we are used to have also been collapsed by the condition of a nationwide lockdown. Nonetheless, the crisis demands urgent and immediate intervention, and we using what was available to us, we got together, and we are hoping that this session helps us collectively engage on a way forward. We do, of course, have some proposals, which is what has brought us here. And Africa Zandi will be moderating the comment section to ensure that engagement is able to reach us. Without any further ado, I will be moderating the conversation. My name is Africa Zukiswa. I have on this call Africa Simthandile, more fondly known as Azania Tyhali, and Africa Lunga, the Deputy President of the People's Movement. Now to just get us, to get us right into it, essentially, as the Africanists, in trying to think through this and craft a way forward, we came with 3 key broad positions, which we feel are a response, a sufficient response to the problem, and which we'd want to engage. We are proposing in a position paper which is currently going around. Some of you may have had access to it already. 3 key issues, right? The first being a complete restructuring of the academic year outside of the imaginations of a Gregorian calendar, right? We are people who value education, we love education. It may be too soon to make a decision on scrapping the academic year, but we are of the view that the preservation of the lives of our people comes secondary to, money and resources, which are essentially what is to be protected by the insistence on continuing the academic year under the circumstances. So we are proposing a restructuring of that, and comrades will speak to that. Secondly, we are proposing, a single university, one Azania, one university. Comrade Mantashe will speak more to what we mean by that. And of course, lastly, to make the previous point possible becomes, the complete change and overhaul of the current teaching pedagogy. Africa Azania, I would like to hand over to you to just help us think through where we are, right, and what informs how we got here, particularly perhaps making the connection between, the issues that have been frustrating stakeholders in the Department of Basic Education, noting, of course, that our view is also informed by the Pan-Africanist Student Organization, who have been actively part of this process of formulating the thinking that has led us here. Is related.
Good evening, Africans. Ikamalam. Azania. So I don't want to dwell much, but I think we have been aware of the crisis, and of course, what the pandemic COVID-19 has, with the crisis it has created both within our communities as well as institutions of learning, primarily your basic education and higher education. So it came to mind that we find ourselves as the youth of the country, or the Pan-Africanist youth, as well as other students within university, that actually the universities with this whole thing of wanting to go and do online learning was not going to be feasible. Following thereof, what we're experiencing at our universities, right, from issues of not only access, but from issues of the students not being able to have these equipment that therefore they are forced to adapt and use when they want to study, which is a laptop and all other things and the data. But central to this, it is better to remind students that itabi here is not about itabi le computer. It is not about itabi le data, but it's about where we find ourselves as abantwana bamnyama, who are dispossessed, who are landless within those institutions of higher learning, and how over the years institutions have tried to maintain the status quo in which we, as is it has tried to maintain our inhumaneness, right? It has tried with the use of this project coaching. No student is going to be left behind. No student shall be left behind. While also, on the other hand, it is continuing Ikubek Fundisa Abandwana, right? So what came to mind thereof, I mean, there are other academics as well, very much concerned with this thing of going to online. But we find that oftentimes, or over the years, the mistake that we have been doing was to solely focus upon higher education, forgetting that ourselves as well are a product of DBE Mzansi Africa, which has been underperforming over the years, right? Which on its own is not well equipped enough to have students going to online learning, which is not equipped enough or has not prepared its learners thereof for online learning. Not even have teachers as enough in classes who were able to assist students, or teachers who would teach certain subjects for students. You find that amidst the crisis within DBE, other students, and we had this information from Africa Pass, so young ones, that look, we find ourselves in a dilemma here as students, both in the township, as students in rural areas, right? One factor being that some did not even have teachers for certain subjects, right? But now they are being forced then to migrate to e-learning. Second to that, abantwana were not even given or do not even know what therefore conditions that they are going to be studying under, right? Which for them on its own posed okanye iyabonakalisa into yobana kukhona nje ungakhathalelwa kobomi babo, and the risk thereof that teachers are concerned and are raising with the fact of going back to school, right? The past week we've seen that either or, a Minister of Education and Zimoteka saying that the students, they're going to go back to school, grade 7 and 12 being Bonabandu, that they're going to primarily focus upon, right? Your grade 7 being people that are going to graduate from primary, going to high school, your matrics thereof being students that are going to, learners that are going to graduate and come to university. That is, of course, if they meet the requirements of the university, which over the years has been the problem with abantwana who are from a basic education and public schools, right? So with that being said, Teachers Union, there is a crisis. With that crisis, classes overcrowded as Golwen. The country at large, even within the sector of health, there are nurses that are on strike because they do not have the protection equipment, right? Not only that, but also how the education system is always used in the country to maintain the status quo and to push, therefore, the state to whatever direction that is going to be headed in, which is under the current discourse we find ourselves in, the neoliberal and globalization of the education system, right? Without first even addressing the fundamental issues that we find ourselves in within the education sector, which do not even emanate within university, but there are problems in which we have carried with to university, right? Which and to our schools, of course, which then ponders a question of what are those universities for, right? In the context and the South African landscape, right? We have seen previously with the call for decolonization of the education system. We have seen with the students calling that they should, universities must accommodate students. We have seen over the years how abantwana, because of their socio-economic background, cannot study, right? We have those realities in South Africa. It is now worse with the pandemic, with the securitization, of course, of the townships, where movement now is very much controlled. Where are you going? Where are you? Not only that, but when we're speaking this online thing, we're speaking to also issues of connectivity. We are speaking to issues of how are we going to produce another generation that is going to contribute to building intelligence in this country, the next intelligentsia of the country. If we continue with learning, how are ideas going to be contested, right? What is then going to happen to the Black child, therefore, who do not have the necessary resources that they need to actually be able to land online, right? You then go to your private sector, your private education, your independent education part, right? Which is your students who are very much from the quasi-middle class of South Africa, others being from the rich of South Africa, right? Who are in proximity or close to the affluence, and who are able and have these resources, and abantwana abamnyama are then forced to compete with those people in terms of resources. They are forced to compete with those people in terms of their academic performance, because at the end of the day, it is going to amount to inferiority. It is going to amount to the qualification that, and as per the lingo that they normally use, that your qualification does not meet, therefore I'm a inferiority for you to then be accepted to another level, or then you cannot do your postgrad because of how you performed on your undergrad level, you know. So we have those things which have been and still happening within our universities. But also, amidst this thing, it has been what I've seen, the silencing of the social sciences as a whole in trying to speak directly to the socio-economic background of many students within the education landscape of South Africa, be it either your basic education, be it either your higher education, right? So over the past 2 weeks, to drive the point home, universities decided to open, they decided to function as well as basic education. But as I've just alluded, the problems that basic education has. You come to higher education, right? The first weeks of the pandemic, majority of students were transported and sent home, right? To say that up until we know therefore what is going to happen, COVID-19 has been controlled enough. So many students went home because they were asked by universities to go home. They did. But now here is a tricky part, and where their large concern comes into existence. One, they are in areas where COVID-19 cases are continuing to grow. Two, not only that, they do not have the necessary resource that is required for them to be able to study online. Three, the university on its own is very much aware of many socio background students, as means that there are children of no boarding, which majority of them are mainly dependent on NSFAS, which on its own, we have seen how the government has said that it is only those that are on NSFAS that are going to then receive as computers that they promise for this e-learning, which for us on its own does not make sense, to say the least, which is why we are advocating. Yeah. So to say the least, ours for advocating then of restructuring and rethinking of the whole education sector. or the education calendar, sorry, it is founded therefore upon some of these issues that
Let's
I've
allow, yes, Doctor, thank you. Thank you so much for really crafting the problem. And I think let's allow Africa Mantashe to come in, because you have contextualized quite well the chickens that have come home to roost in the context of 26 years of absolute ongoing systemic corruption by a democratic government taking over from hundreds of years of plunder, and we are still being plundered even today. And the consequences of this are showing in exactly the kinds of things that make a agile response to this crisis that could make the educating of our people possible, the access to healthcare of our people possible, is completely not a reality. So we would have missed a critical opportunity to make gains towards some of the ideas we have long advanced of really rallying our people behind this kind of intervention. I want Lunga, noting that when you think of the Department of Basic Education as a sector, we are thinking of teachers, we are thinking of parents, of learners, we are thinking of student government bodies, we are thinking of unions, right? What does restructuring of an academic calendar mean in that, and what are some of the consequences of that? And speak to us, Mafrika Lunga, around the thinking that has informed that and the kinds of proposals put forward of how the government, if it really wants to exercise social and political will, can make this a plausible solution, as opposed to the implausible, unworkable, irresponsible, and reckless proposals currently being made. Israel.
Yeah, Israel. I think that the first point to make is that when you talk about restructuring, you're not talking about scrapping an entire year, because you're not thinking in terms of the Gregorian calendar that begins on January. The calendar begins on January and ends on December. So what we say is that you don't scrap anything off. We've never had a calendar anyway in this country. We've adopted everything. So what we say is you've got to begin your academic year at any point in time when the virus subsides. Don't say I'm going to begin on June. Don't say I'm going to begin on July. Say I'm going to be guided by science. Don't put our kids at risk because you are sitting in Sentin and Waterkloof and having, a nice time in a nice bedroom, and you don't have to go to work. You are not a teacher that has to go and teach this child and expose both him or herself and this child. This is problematic. This is silly. This is dangerous. This is wrong. It shouldn't happen that way. So restructuring simply means be guided by science, not this quasi-science that has guided the government today, which is the science of opening things up in a so-called phased-in approach. There's no such thing as phased-in approach. If you're going to send about 100,000 kids, how many matriculants are writing a matric each year? There are about 600,000. You are going to send out 600,000 kids to school every year, and they're going to have to return to their locations every year and meet their parents every year and subject them to a possibility of an infection. Are you going to disinfect schools? Are you going to have money to build classes that do not exist in some rural schools? Some rural schools don't have computers, they don't have classes, they don't have teachers, they don't have computers, they don't have data, they have no signal, let alone having phones with airtime. This is ridiculous. Anyone who thinks that they're going to solve the problem by, assuming that you can have a phased-in approach, that is not science, that is quasi-science, it's pseudo-science, it's wrong, it's false, it's political, and we shouldn't play, politics with the lives of our people. So that's what restructuring means. So what you then do, in the last point I want to make, what you then do is that you open the time for the school, and you create a leg, what I call a leg between a high school and a university and a college. By that, I mean that there has to be a period of about, say, 2 to 3 months. Because if you read the current status quo, you know that on January, students get their results, learners get their results from matric. And when they get their results, it is only then that they can be finally admitted at university on the basis of their results. Now, with the approach that we are proposing here, you don't have to go that much. If you have a 2-3 months period in between, you can allow an opportunity for a university to make admissions on the basis of a certificate, not on the basis of a statement that is provisional. That was a statement from June or something like that. So that's what we propose. And then you can then solve too many other problems that are attendant. What are these problems? One of these problems is that students at university don't get their NSFAS on time. They don't get their money on time. They can't buy textbooks on time. In some rural, historically black universities, they only get their NSFAS money around July, some of them around May. If they get it anytime early, it could be around April. But what are they eating in January, February, March? How do they buy books between that time? So the state's budget is read on February and it is distributed on April. So when you restructure the calendar, you hit too many birds with one stone. One of the birds that you hit is that you make sure that a student, when they get to class, they have everything that they need to begin a class. Just finally, to make a point on this notion of e-learning, which has already been taking place by celebrity teachers on TV and elsewhere. The point of the matter is that there are socio-economic and cultural dynamic realities in rural areas and in townships, as some of these issues Azania has already highlighted. You've got congested spaces, you don't have a phone, or you have a phone but no airtime, or you have a phone with airtime but no network, or you have both but no money. You understand? So you can't solve any of these problems, you see, by simply putting up an e-learning. E-learning requires teachers themselves to be fundamentally trained, because it's a different teaching, it's a different pedagogy altogether. It's a different way of teaching, it's a different way of learning, it's a different way of assessing. You can't assess kids online for the first time, and you can't know how to assess them online for the first time. You must undergo training yourself. You can't teach them online. You've got to learn how to teach. It's like asking, for example, me to be a TV personality and a TV presenter tomorrow and go and read news or present news. It doesn't happen. It never happens. So you've got to find a way to help teachers undergo it. This is why you've got to have a university that changes the way it trains teachers. Because we have seen at the level of PASO, from as early as the time PASO was formed, we had seen that if you wanted to evolve with technology, your education system should speak to e-learning, but e-learning in the absence of computers, e-learning in the absence of infrastructure in the form of data, when data costs are so high. Where is the government going to get these hundreds of billions of rands? As things stand, Zuki, government spends around 240 billion in this country for the education. This is about 15% of the state's budget. This is the highest budget the government spends than any country like Germany, like US, like UK. Yet these countries are far advanced than us in the schools that they have. What does this money really do when it gets and filters down on the ground? What do? They eat it, they squander it, they corrupt it, they plunder it, just like they are doing with the PPEs as we speak, just like they are doing with the tenderpreneurship process as we speak, just like they are doing now overriding their own supply chain processes. So that's what you need to do. So let me not spend more time. Let me give it back to you. But that's what restructuring actually means.
Sure. Thank you so much, Lunga. So moving to the question around e-learning, right, and zooming in on that. Some argue that this crisis is an opportunity for the South African government to really think deeply and strategize around resolving a problem which of course they could have done 26 years later, stemming from the colonial apartheid legacy. of the complete disparity between so-called previously white universities and so-called previously Black universities, right? I'm interested, Azania, I know this came up as we were thinking what a active campaign would look like. How do we speak to, so not even how do we rally like students, because as we know, we can make a call to students to, support this process of us trying to lobby for a restructuring of the academic calendar. But what about, we know that University of Pretoria opened on Monday. We know that WITS has already opened, and we also know that there's other processes of institutions of higher learning. What do we do about the fact that some people will continue to study, right? Not even as a betrayal to some greater cause, but in the context of the reality that some students, right, in the countrysides, in informal settlements, are simply not going to be able to meet the demands of an academic calendar, right? Particularly one that relies on, that relies on contact learning. What do we say to that? And how do we imagine to deal with that? So while we are pushing for this process, how do we mitigate against the potential lag of students who are not white, who are not middle class and otherwise privileged, who will reap the benefits of a online academic calendar at the expense of the majority of African students who simply aren't going to be able to do that?
So, okay, I thank you very much, Zuki. I think it's firstly very important to mention first that even amidst us speaking of issues of scrapping of the academic year or restructuring, therefore, of how the academic year of South Africa First is currently made up and how we move forward in that, right? It is also important to mention that outside of rhetoric or anything for that matter, but it is important to mention that universities are an extension of the outer community, right? We have seen in first of all, one, what is a study environment that is conducive for a student to study in, right? And I'm making it in relations currently to how students over the years have been fighting to be accommodated to universities because of the environment are not, first of all, conducive for them to study, one. Two, we have also, again, cases of COVID-19, which are currently in the country. We don't know as to what and where by August we are going to be, right? We don't know if we peak COVID-19 or what is going to happen, but the likelihood of it is very large, right? Two, we have seen that the universities that are opening are the previously white universities, your liberal institutions, and this is simply because of their historical position, right? To say that those universities have funds put into place, right? But also at the same time, it is very important to mention that within even those universities where they have funds put into place and they're just going to provide data and a laptop to students, because it is important again to mention that it is not only about the data, it is not only about not receiving the computer, but what is important here is how then do we reframe the pedagogy? Because still, the decolonial conversation, it is still a conversation that is still very much taking place within our universities, right? Two, we are currently, even amidst that debate of decolonization, we have universities that are forcing us to move into the fourth industrial revolution by forcing this thing of e-learning, right? So I do understand that majority of students are going to or have already been studying, right? Either because of privilege that universities affords them, right? And also because of the lack of solidarity thereof from the students within these universities. It is also important to mention that what is important for us now in moving forward, because I know for a fact with the university I am from, we do not have money to buy laptops for the populace of students. And I am talking about with 30% that they say is poor, but still they do not have money enough to pay for students, right? We have those universities that must first go to their alumni, they must go to the business sector to get money so that they buy these computers, right? At the same time, we are from these black universities that are managed like isbaza shops that are not transparent to us as students as to what then, where, how do we get these things, where is the funding, right? Because any institution must have money that is put on coffers so to address issues as finance when crises come into existence. But as better stand, and as students who are black, as students who come from the rural areas or the countryside rather, as students who domicile within the townships, the situation here too has not changed. The situation here too and amatabi that we find ourselves battling with within universities are still the same matabi that Abantu were fighting for in 1997, formation of the student movement, and previous years, your 1976 uprising, up until to this day, your Fees Must Fall movement. We are still fighting for the very same things that universities normally tend to say that as we end or they are feasible. But here's the moment and the crisis we find ourselves in, whereas there were things that the students were advocating for that, listen, give students laptop before we were exposed to a pandemic. Give students data before they are exposed to a pandemic, right? Because I'm certainly sure by now had universities listened to the call of students as the rightful stakeholders, because it is important that we mention that the stakeholders of the universities are students, not the council of the university, not the management of the university, but the students are the rightful stakeholders of the university. They have a right to question the powers that be and bring them and also understand that ours currently as the Africanist bloc, ours as the conscious bloc within the universities, in the midst of this crisis, it is very important that we problematize our institutions, because this is where this structured inequality in a way is maintained, right? Because we're sold this facade that computers, then all is going to be well. Not all is going to be well, Africa. Not all is going to be well, because even over the years, students have been excluded. And I'm talking about core basic education and even in higher education have been excluded over the years. Be it issues of not having 50 rand to pay building fines, be it issues of owing money at university. They have always found ways and mechanisms to exclude students. It will not be the first time that students are excluded. So mine is simple. For us then to understand what solidarity entails, it would mean for us not to see kumbaya South Africa that currently is being pushed by the capitalists to control the country, which of course has been even adopted by the leftist bloc of the country, who has been silent to these issues, right? Because these issues as conjure. So it also speaks to the silence of the left when we come to these critical times and moments where the left must then be seen, where the left must problematize the state, because it is also important that in our problematizing we bring physical solutions, right? So one would be students in them being in solidarity, right? It's important that one, they understand, but they must not log into these things that they're given to by universities, one, right? And I'm not saying that they must not log in, but also with that being said, I want to log into this site, but they cannot download the material to engage because of they do not have the necessary data to download those things. Number two, we're going to produce, this is what I'm really scared of, uncritical students, right? We are going to produce students that are not going to be able to contest in spaces, because I think that is the beauty and of lecture halls, where we from different backgrounds that which we come from, you know, it's universities are spaces whereby even Amapujo are brought into realization that, you know what, bourgeois as you might be, but you are still black, right? Even if your opulence is to whiteness, but it does not change the existential crisis. And those conversations normally take place within these universities. Now, if then we migrate to on e-learning, and then a large majority of students are left behind, it means therefore we want to contribute to a society as a producer and only an educated elite that is able to afford and that is able by my conducive environment and study. Right. So for me, it is important that we form a solid space, solidify the students to understand this, and it's possible from all angles, from grassroots level to anything, because if we are not in solidarity as students currently, believe you me, universities, each and every time we're facing a crisis, they are going to come up with a method as Ofunda, and they're going to over and over again test them on us. And at the end of the day, we are going to be excluded within the spaces because of we don't even know how these things function, or we're not better equipped to deal with these things.
Thank you for that, Azania. And I think this is a good place to say that while, of course, the call is to students to be in kind of speak in one voice and be in solidarity, we also know that, as you spoke of earlier, that what are the practical solutions and realities which make that possible? And, there are, as the three of us know, Africanists of the movement who are in the legal field, who concurrently to this process are looking into exploring what a class action will look like as a way to actually interdict institutions of higher learning in the state, on the grounds of unconstitutionality and others. So it is important that a process happens where we are, campaigning towards this endeavor. But we want to also emphasize to Africa that, of course, we must learn lessons from the past, and that two processes can happen concurrently. And outside of that, what are other things that we can begin to think of to realize this campaign in real practical ways to ensure that, Black students are supported, and that regardless of even in the face of lack of the principal solidarity, what is happening to secure those things. And I want to then go to you once more, Comrade DP. We have engaged as the Africanists and over the course of this call that two processes essentially need to happen. We need to figure out what does it mean to respond in agile ways now, particularly in the absence of a lack of an organized response against these urgent immediate issues. But also concurrently to that, what is the forward thinkingness that we need to, and the work that we need to be doing to be able to usher in a country closer to the Azania that we want and the Azania that we deserve. And we have managed to sort of think through that. And I want you to speak to Africa around this notion of, a single university with rationed resources and funding taking over from Azania's great articulation there, and responding to the fact that are we doing enough as the Azanian left in particular to ready ourselves to take advantage of the full, to take advantage of the kinds of left-leaning policies and what this moment is making possible politically post this COVID-19 period. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Suki. I think the first thing to say about a single university is that I don't believe that the masses of Azania have this imagination so far, because it has taken most people in this country 60 years to realize that we needed land. And they're having a debate 2 years ago, a fake debate, by the way, that we need land and so on and so on. And when we start with this question of a single university, and by the way, this question was debated and proposed at some point by Paso in the early 90s, and Paso was thinking ahead, was looking at questions of technology and science evolving, thinking about how can a student in Bizana be able to submit an assignment? How can a student, for example, in Zingi be able to access a university without necessarily going to WITS, but access the same kind of education? And that's why the notion of a single university really comes in. So how does a single university look like? It looks precisely the same way we want Africa to be united, right? It looks like an institution that is one, not the one proposed currently by the National Qualifications Framework, which claims to coordinate, integrate all universities. That kind of thing, Zugi, is fake. You know, you get vice chancellors, committees, and structures meeting, and yet they are functioning in silos. You've got, for example, an institution like a UCT that's got its own private sponsors, it's got its own private monies funded by white capital to keep it exclusively white and to protect white capital and neo-colonialism. You've got an institution like Witwatersrand, which, by the way, was opened as a consequence of the founding of mineral resources in this country, and just like like UCT. So the point is, you have got to create conditions of a united, integrated, well-coordinated, effective single university, where it must be possible for Zuki, for example, to register anywhere. They don't need to go to any other, they don't need to cross some supposed superficial border to go and register. They don't need to, they can receive a lecture, for example, from a WITS lecturer who has access to various resources. They can go, for example, to WITS University as it stands right now in UCT and UOFS and UP and Rhodes, and take some of those reserves that those institutions are keeping. And that's the question of rationing resources. How can, for example, an institution have billions of reserves and there's a deficit, for example, there's a loss. Walter Sisulu is running at a loss just on the other side of the town, and we're running the same country. Are we running the same country, or are we running an Orania and South Africa with some Lesotho and some Swaziland in it? How can you have a university like that? So you've got to build a coordinated university, not a fake one. The last portion of the argument and I'm trying here to speak at a sort of a high level of this formation, that we don't have time to go through it. Perhaps we should take some time and have a discussion purely and only on this question of a single university. But the other aspect pertains to the question of funding. As I have said earlier on, the government puts in a lot of money in these universities, but where does this funding really go? This funding goes to tenderpreneurs. This funding goes to privatization. This funding goes to outsourcing. So in other words, the struggle for a single university must be intertwined with the struggle for socialist education and anti-privatization struggle, because you can't manage resources effectively if you keep letting resources go away. I mean, who hires a company that will hire an ant to sweep for millions of rands, wasting money out of the university, giving money to the bourgeois in the name of Black economic empowerment? These are the kinds of things that the African National Congress has done to create a BEE and a triple BEE to cause crisis even in institutions of higher learning, to privatize residences and all that type of thing. You can't have a university like that. It simply can't run in that way. So what's the point? The point is also to increase. We must be calling for the increase of funding of these so-called historically Black universities, which I often call presently Black institutions. And there are also those so-called historically white institutions, which I call presently exclusively white institutions with few integrated Blacks in them. But these are still historically colonial institutions, which we need to get rid of. And that's what we need to do. And I see probably we're running out of time. Let me make the last point here. If you are going to talk about a single integrated university, a coordinated, you can't talk about it outside the context of technology and science and innovation and online teaching and e-learning. So what they now call e-learning. The point here is to think about e-learning in two ways. One, think about how this changes the way Zuki studies. If Zuki doesn't necessarily have to go to meet a lecturer, but they can get resources online, is Zuki culturally and socially capable of learning on her own? What is the background of Zuki? What is the background of Azania? You see, what is the background of that child from Katyane, my own place, who has never seen a computer, who simply watches things on TV? So what it means that your kind of e-learning must be a socialist pedagogy of a Freirean sort. It must be possible, as we're talking now on Facebook, and through Zoom, it must be possible for people to talk to and engage online with their lecturers, but that requires a fundamentally new culture of learning, a fundamentally new culture of pedagogy altogether. That's why training institutions must train different teachers, different lecturers for a new Azania, for a united Azania with one university. If you have one university, if you have one country, you've got to have one university, one database system. The government of this country doesn't even know how many graduates are there, what they graduated on, and for what. It doesn't even know how many engineers we have, how many are unemployed, and why. This is not a system of education you want. You want to build a strategically united one.
Thank you, Chair. And of course, there is the issue that when students have paid for their education on a purely contractual basis alone, right? The assumption when fees are paid by NSFAS, by BERSAS, by parents, is that you are paying for contact learning as part of the service. So this is really and what should happen then in this e-learning thing, which is that then are the returning of student fees. But that's an aside. The point I'm trying to make here is that institutions of higher learning in particular are making a case for this online learning simply because they are as a desperate kind of way to hold on to money and resources which are not due to them in any case. And I am interested, Azania, I know that you spoke to this on your social media, on the question of what do we do? Like, what does a sort of linking this with community struggles at this time when we are facing a impending public health crisis look like? What does it mean for student worker solidarity? What does it mean for us in our communities if we are saying that because we value education, we value it so much that we are demanding that education be accessible to all, and because we love this country and its people so much, we are demanding that our teachers and students and learners be kept safe until we are in the clear. So what do we do with this capacity? Should the question be posed to say that, okay, well, let's say that we're in the clear in August. Is there a way in which we can imagine how we can be in solidarity with our people, and how we could make this moment, this political moment, useful in particular ways? I don't know if you have ideas on that. I know there was a paper shared by Africa Lwazi around this kind of thing. So I wonder if you have any input on that, to link it with what Africa Lunga is saying around the importance of for thinking a education which is socialist and decolonial.
Oh, of course, thank you. It's really not easy as it might seem, right? But I think what is important here is for us first to actually think really around how COVID has been happening in South Africa, because also Nati, we are trying to be realistically as possibly as we can with the solutions that we are bringing forth. With that being said, for the Department of Basic Education, right, there are SGBs, there's the South African Democratic Teachers Union. I had read a newspaper article where they were totally against the reopening of Iskolo, right? I've also seen students at grassroots level from DBE who are against e-learning, right? There's also parents at hand who must be involved, right? But the current rhetoric, therefore, that is being sent around to Abantu is that I saw from the MEC of Health in the Eastern Cape that if the nuclear fumigator, if izikolo are being fumigated, which means therefore that it's going to be safe environments for students to come back, right? He then poses a question to say, is it better that students or learners are on the street or rather than them being at school, you know, which for me was students, for me, learners are better off running around the streets of the township, right? Because there is a problem that with this pandemic, right, and how it spreads. One, majority of indawo esihlala kuzo a child from site B studies in a school in site C, a child from Philippi studies in that particular school also in site C in Tyhali, right? These children, these children come from different zones who have been exposed in different levels in terms of the pandemic. We still again, and I think I've said this earlier, that we still again have a backlog of a number of COVID-19 of people that actually that have been diagnosed with the COVID-19. Two, and three, actually, we have not actually even been given as to Abantu who have been contacted or Abantu COVID-19, how do they die, right? There is a lot of knowledge, okay, there's a lot of information that has been kept about doing, right? And this is to say that we do understand that the government currently, the health system of South Africa is incapable of releasing a number of cases as you might require, right? So how do we then try still while abantu basafuna nabo, because abanye abantu basafuna test, a quarter of the population is not even being tested, for crying out loud, and students are forced to go back to school, learners from townships, right? We're talking about e-communities where there was not even water before COVID-19, but now there's suddenly water. No man's you know. So for me, what is important is that we need to speak to that body, teachers, student governing body, and the learners, right? We come to university. The universities, we need to mobilize the academics, right? From social sciences, academics from sciences, and the academics at large, and students, right? We also need to come to the fact that ours is not only to address the issues that are within the education sector, but we're also addressing issues at grassroots level, right? Then how do we again address the issues of Abantu that are currently living on the streets, but we have these students that have been sent home, and those universities are without people currently, right? How do we use universities to address the COVID-19 issue while we're addressing the issues that are caused by e-learning? Right. So these are things, therefore, that can be feasible. The government can even on its own for now, because the question that people would want to ponder upon will be the question of their health. It will be the question of their safety when they come and expose these people, and in terms of speaking to solidarity. But it is also important that somewhere, somehow, we are going to need to meet as people, and somewhere, somehow, we are going to need to discuss these issues. But for now, it is very important that people at grassroots level, they must join this cause, right? Because I think we have called the Clarion call. Mafukulazi has written on it very beautifully. The paper is available also online. And also students can also read from that and understand where we are coming from and what we're saying when we're arguing that the current curriculum, the current academic calendar must be restructured and be relooked. Not only that, because abanye abantu have concerns with their finances, with their bursaries, with their NSFAs, it must also be made aware that also a financial calendar, the financial budget must also be restructured again to address the issues that were faced by students during this pandemic. Because also there were students who were still appeals, and as far as appeals that have not been answered, you know, all of those things. So these issues are known to students. Yeah. Thank you, Africans.
So I'm so sorry, noble daughter. We were given the 1 hour, but thank you so much for that. Lunga Mantashe, in about 60 seconds at max, closing remarks from you before we close this call. Thank you.
Yes, I think, Zuki, the things that we should take out of this process is that we are opening up a dialogue as the PAC and as Africanists. We have always done so for the past years. We've done so 60 years ago on the question of land, and we have done so on the question of education. We have said that education cannot be a commodity, but secondly, it must be socialized. It must belong to a community, and therefore universities can't be markets. But what we are now saying is that you've got to restructure the calendar completely. Your year must no longer begin on January. It can begin anytime, let's say September, when the virus subsides. Secondly, we say we want to build a single university. And thirdly, we want to say we need to build a new culture of pedagogy. And that pedagogy must be socialistic in nature, because our view as the PAC is that we want to build a country with a socialist economic content. If our content must be socialistic, it means that our teaching and pedagogy and the values which we imbibe on students at university and at basic education and college must themselves be socialistic, and they must be Africanistic and democratic. And that's what we need to do going forward. Just a final point, and maybe I know we probably are gonna. So I think we've got. We've got a little bit of 5 minutes because we started 5 minutes late. So let's just use that 5 minutes a little bit. So I want to make, yeah. Okay. So the point I wanted to make, Zuki, is that that's what we want to do. So if you are going to build an Africanist socialist democratic order, it must be a united university, a single university. What you must do is go back to basic education, teach computer literacy, teach it to kids at a tender age, teach it to teachers, train teachers, because learning is a culture. It does not begin when you pass grade 12 or when you enter university. In fact, there has been a problem of transitioning, because the university and a high school and a college are separate things. And that's what Mr. Zuma did in 2009 when they started separating these institutions, assuming that they were too big to manage. I've never had that before. I thought that they were going to have a minister and then managers. So that's what you need to do. You need to unite the entire institution of learning. You don't want to have institutions of learning propagating their own things, supported by capital for exclusively an idea of building a middle-class group that will say yes to COVID-19. And my final point here, Zuki, is that as we're in this COVID, we've got to remember people who are victims, that the people who are victims are not capitalists who themselves have forced workers through forcing government, and as though they failed on the tobacco issue, but they have forced government to go back to work, to tell people to go back to work. About 1.5 million people are working, and they could be exposed to the virus. You want to add, insult to injury by putting kids, at school. This is dangerous. Government has no money. It steals what it has. It does not use it to build society. And that's the message that we want to leave. Let's come together in solidarity and build an Africanist socialist alternative. There's no other alternative.
Is relate to Comrade DP, because I had interrupted the noble daughter thinking we're running out of time. I am going to hand over to her as well to give us some closing remarks. Thank you for that, President. Africa Azania?
Yeah, of course. Firstly, thank you for the Africans. But for me, it's very important that I just need to remind Africans the importance of solidarity moving forward. Our mother, Ubenux, is very clear on what solidarity means. He makes a beautiful distinction between solidarity and support. So, that as we move beyond and as we move forward, we have this conversation, right? And this conversation do not take away our people. There must not only be conversations that are conversations that speak to only us, those that find themselves privileged enough to be at institutions of higher learning, but it must be issues, it must be solidarity that speaks to the high interest and at our people at large and at heart and in South Africa as a whole, because we do understand that the current status quo that has been maintained by the current existing government, it is a status quo, nothing has changed post 1994, and we are still in post-apartheid South Africa, what we're experiencing, therefore, as abantu abamnyama, is that capitalism is anti-humanity, it is anti-us, and now we find ourselves having to compete for survival, you know. It is the survival of the fittest indeed in the current society that we live in. So it's important that as the young people, as the youth of the country, we try to reimagine the society that we envisage. We try to reimagine a South Africa that we would want to give birth to. And we also try to imagine ourselves as being free, because I also think that at the center of us being at times is because of we fear our freedom. We fear thereof experiencing what would freedom mean to us and entail to us. So we must want freedom in our conditions, because we are the people that have been dispersed and taken away our freedom and our livelihood as beings. So it's important that in this pandemic as well, we do remain critical of our existential crisis. We do continue problematizing the current capitalist system that exists, you know, and we continue to want to dismantle it, and we cannot do that without being without solidarity. So with that said, Africa, I do hope that this is not the first, but it's many conversations coming. Thank you.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Lunga and Azania. Parents, teachers, you know, unions, learners in basic education, Black academics in institutions of higher learning, students across, you know, institutions of higher learnings. This is a campaign that belongs to you, that is in service of you. Can we rally behind this one important demand which responds to the crisis we find ourselves in this current moment, which essentially is there's absolutely no way that we can think of saving an academic year in the ways that the government of the day is proposing, right? The closest, most practical, feasible way is a restructuring. You know, conditions of e-learning being a reality in this country is going to rely exclusively on the complete overhaul of the socioeconomic setup in this country. And that is not going to happen you know, anytime soon, but for e-learning to be possible, that is the only condition, even with the resumption of contact learning for basic education, until we are cleared of this public health crisis. There is no way that we are ushering our children to their deaths. Comrades, Africanists, we are saying that let us ensure that we hold the government of the day accountable, and that they do not get away with decision-making which would have a complete devastating impact on the lives of African people. We are saying e-learning resumes. We are saying that contact learning at DBE will resume once we are in the clear, and we are saying that e-learning can resume, should resume, but not before the socioeconomic issues which make it impossible are resolved. Until then, we are calling for a restructuring of the academic calendar, and we will, as the Africanists, be pursuing all channels, including legal options, and of course intensive campaigning to ensure that we realize the objective of this political project, which in a nutshell is fighting for education to be accessible for everyone. Thank you for joining us, Ma-Africa. And as Azania and Lunga have alluded to, we will be continuing with this conversation. And of course, the draft position paper is but only a draft. We are meeting tomorrow as the Africanists at 4 o'clock. If you are interested, if you want to contribute, please do make use of that platform. With that, Ma-Africa, Izleto.
Very good, John.
Africa. Thank you.
Thank you.